Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I know you can't, you have your microphones muted and it's a shame that I can't hear you say good afternoon to me, but if you can unmute and just say good afternoon, that would be nice.
Yeah. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Professor
Good
Bawa.
afternoon.
How nice to see you, Professor Bawa.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome.
Hello.
I always really like that. I don't like this thing where you say hello and good afternoon and everyone is just quiet. I like the energy that we all bring when we greet each other back. So thank you for indulging me. Hello. So you're welcome to our program today, our event, which has been organized by the Resource Center for Public Sociology here at York University. I would like to start by doing a land acknowledgement, obviously. So, and also just to remind everyone again, those of you who've just joined, that we are recording the event, and after the recording, we will be hosting it on our website at the Resource Center for Public Sociology. So York University recognizes that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The university acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and it's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Pond Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, the Resource Center for Public Sociology is a center that is located within the sociology department at York University. And our activities link the university with local, national, and global communities. We do a whole bunch of things, including talks like this, where we aim to have a conversation with communities that are around York University in particular. Of course, today's conversation is with the very engaged Jane Finch research group, who are going to be doing a presentation to us on experiential education. We also aim in this center to promote and advance public sociological research which maps power and inequality, to develop innovative approaches for communicating sociological research to multiple publics, and to promote methods of public sociology in teaching at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Now, having said that, I am now happy to be able to introduce you to the speakers for today. So today's presentation aims to outline current explorations to map out what it means to do experiential education with the Jane and Finch community. And so we are going to be engaging with this in this conversation, or the conversation will be led by Abina Ofei-Jima, who is the project co-lead, and Shinali Dawn, who is the community research coordinator. Now, Abina Ofei-Jima is a writer, a researcher, a food consultant, and an advocate for an indigenous food sovereignty system. She's worked at Black Creek Community Farm as a coordinator for the youth farming program, with Building Roots as an urban garden coordinator, with North York Community House as a strong neighborhood coordinator, and currently project co-lead with the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. Her food business, Ada Blooms, seeks to work with small-scale farmers to bring ancestral foods worldwide. Her blog, it's indicated, and I'll share that blog with you later, also seeks to explore those intersections between food, culture, and equity. Abina is passionate about preserving indigenous plants, seeds, and seeks to work in collaboration with small-scale African farmers to grow and preserve ancestral foods. If we may just please give Abina a round of applause and welcome, Abina. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for all the work you do. Now, Shinali Dawn is an undergraduate student pursuing communication studies and human resource management and she's working towards a career in public relations. She has worked and continues to work with a number of community organizations, and currently she's the programs manager of the Flaunted movement and community research coordinator on the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. Shinali has successfully planned and supported a number of community-based campaigns, large events, research projects, and more, all driven by her passion for strengthening communities and expanding her knowledge. Let us also welcome Shinali, and thank you also for all the work that you do. All right, with that out of the way, I would also like to, of course, acknowledge the presence of all of you who've joined us on a Thursday afternoon and willing to spend time with us. And also to thank Susan Foster, we just call her Sue, but Susan Foster, from whom you would have received emails, for all the work. She's pulled all of this together. So she is the one that has the magic wand that has brought us here together. And also I'd like to acknowledge, of course, the presence of the chair of the sociology department, Mark Thomas, as well as so many other colleagues who've worked with the RCPS and are here today, and obviously all of you. So welcome, everyone. I'll now turn it over to Abena and Shinali to take us through the presentation. After the presentation, we will then engage in a Q&A. Thank you, Abena and Shinali.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Sylvia Bawa. Hi, everyone, good afternoon. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Yeah, but yes, good afternoon. And thank you for joining us. It's probably lunchtime, but yes, thank you. So I'm Abena Ofejima, project co-lead for the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. Today's conversation is experiential education with and not in the Jane Finch community. So it's really looking at respectful and reciprocal experiential education with Jane Finch community partners. This project is fairly new, and so we started it, and we'll talk a bit more about it as time goes on. We started this project just last year, so I would say like August, September last year. So it's fairly new, and this presentation is really sharing the process and the findings. Our work is about understanding what the community needs when it comes to experiential education. Experiential education looks like one thing for the university, but then it also looks like another thing, right, for the community. And it's really around how do we rethink, how do we renegotiate university-community relationship or university-community partnership? And how does that play within the future of doing collaborative work? So when we look at York University and the Jane Finch community in particular, there's a historical relationship there. And the historical relationship hasn't always been a reciprocal one. It hasn't always been an equal relationship between the institution and the community. The institution comes with power, it comes with knowledge, it comes with resources. The institution is able to tell its own story, it's able to tell its own narrative, right? And it carries a narrative about itself, and it's well positioned. Whereas the community is not often seen as the knower, right? The community is often seen as the space in which things are done to. So researchers will go into a community, students go into a community. So the community is not often positioned as a site of knowing or as a space in which knowledge is produced from. So we can talk about Jane Finch and York University without addressing that the historical relationship has not always been fair. There's always been stereotypes, misconceptions that have been perpetuated by the academy, right? About who and what Jane Finch is. We've seen some of this in orientation. So previously in some York University orientation, students are told not to cross the Shoreham bridge, right, into the community. So that paints a particular perspective to new and incoming students about who and what the community is, but more so who lives in the community and who they are. Before students even meet the residents, there's already a perception, right, on who the residents are. And there's been countless, right? There's been countless experiences looking at unequal relationship when it comes to resource sharing, when it comes to a lot of youth in the community not being able to access the institution, but even when it comes to hiring, right? So really looking, it's a larger conversation around university community partnership within the context of capitalism, neoliberalism. What does that look like, right, in terms of collaborative work? But also, what does it look like as the university now shifts towards a mandate where experiential education is becoming a key part of a student's education? So we will be delving into our work a bit more. Next slide.
Okay, so my name is Shanali. I will get on with the land acknowledgement just before we begin. So the community that is now known as the Jane Finch community has been inhabited for generations beyond our knowing. We recognize the historical territories of the Huron-Wendat, Petun, Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit Indigenous peoples. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampun Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this region is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, including many survivors and intergenerational family members who have been impacted by the legacy of the residential school system.
Thanks, Shanali. So the Jane and Finch Community Research Partnership is made up of community residents like myself, Shanali, Farwa, Sean, who also make up the core working team. It's made up of community organizations, grassroots groups, and York University researchers, right? Such as Dr. Natalie Coulter, Dr. Ellie, Andrea Kosovac from the library, Lorna Schwarzentruber, and a few folks, right? And Lorna Ernwin that are a part of the core team. This group was created in 2016 as a result of ongoing sort of unhealthy, ongoing research relationship between the Jane and Finch community and York University. And so the group was started to really address, to really ask who gets to do research in the Jane and Finch community, right? And what happens within the research that happens, the research that's produced in the Jane and Finch community, how do community members access it? So in 2016, a community member who was seeking research on and about Jane and Finch community started really asking a lot of these questions. And a lot of the work that was done here was built up a group called Connect the Dots that were also challenging and asking questions around university community partnership. And so from there in 2016, there were 2 meetings that were set up. And the first question that was really asked was around what research exists within the Jane and Finch community? And secondly, how do community members access the research that exists within the community? So a lot of our work was really around ethical, respectful research relationships, and really looking at, Shanali would touch on that in the community background, and really looking at how do we create an ethical, respectful process in which research that is done in the Jane and Finch community can honor not just the community, but also the residents. Next slide.
Okay, so I'll go into the community background a little bit. I know Abna touched on it a little bit, but as you may or may not know, the Jane and Finch community is known for its extensive grassroots movement and work. So, and throughout the years, community members have always been at the forefront of shaping and speaking back to how institutions seek to define and control partnership, collaboration, and community throughout the years. So from all these conversations, and community members came together to the 2013 Connect the Dot Symposium and came up with the goal from this symposium to look into a community person who can sit on the research ethics board at York University. So, however, it was quickly learned that one person was not feasible to be on the York U Ethics Board because, you know, this one person would be sitting on the York U Ethics Board receiving a lot of different research proposals and papers, and it just wasn't a feasible option to have someone there. And it was then discussed the possibilities of creating a community ethics board with resources to support residents to determine what research comes into community and what impacts the research can have on community. And then the Connect the Dots also looked at the best practices for engaging in the local community. So it was a symposium where many people came together. It was community residents, leaders, researchers, professors, some York U staff. Everyone gathered together to discuss the racial profiling that was going on at the time, and continues to go on. However, at the time, it was to discuss the racial profiling in the community, as well as debunking the stereotypes about the community and unpacking the power, privilege, and oppression. In 2016, then came the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership, which is who we are today. And from this, there was two goals. There was the community ethics principles and the community repository for access and increased knowledge mobilization. So from this, the questions were asked of how do community residents access the research that's been done on the community, and what research has been done in the community throughout the years, because research wasn't always something that was accessible in the community. It still is a challenge, right? So if community members want to learn about Jane Finch, it was really difficult to access different literature, right? And it was definitely a challenge that needed to be addressed. So this also led to the Community Ethics Principles document, which can be found on the Jane Finch Research website, which I will link as well. And then came the 2019 SHIRT grant. We will be going into that, the work that's been done on that, so I won't speak on that too much. And then here we are with the 2021 Aif grant. So the Aif grant is the grant that is currently funding us right now. The full name, sorry if you can hear all the background noise, my window is open. But the Aif grant is the Experiential Education with and not in Respectful and Reciprocal Experiential Education with Jane Finch Community Partners. So the Aif grant is a partnership between Dr. Natalie Coulter from the Communications Department and Byron Gray, the manager of the Community Engagement Center, also known as CEC, and the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. And the goal of this grant is to better inform the processes and manners in which placement students and internship activities take place within Jane Finch, to ensure that experiential education really captures the well-being of the community, as well as supporting the York students in the ways that are respectful, sustainable, reciprocal, and just for both the community and the students. Because over the years, we realized experiential education, their experience really depends on, you know, they're coming into a community with their lived experiences, and not everyone has the same background and knowledge of communities that is needed to work within the community. So the three main objectives of the grant is to establish a community advisory board to guide the direction of the project, develop the principles of respectful and reciprocal experiential education in Jane Finch that meet both the needs of the community and the stakeholders at York across the university, as well as developing 6 to 8 digital modules that are geared for undergraduates doing experiential educations. And we will go into these modules and themes later on.
Thanks, Shanelli. And so with this grant, the entire goal is at the end of the grant to be able to create a set of principles that guide and shape how experiential education is done in Jane Finch. So we already have principles that guide and shape how research is done in Jane Finch. And just to discuss a bit of the principles that we have. So the previous principles is strictly on research. It looks at, you know, respect for the community, respect for residents, concern for well-being, social justice, accountability, and so on. Even though those principles are specifically for looking at how research is done in Jane Finch and are strictly made for researchers coming in, what we're looking to do here is how can we, through our consultations and through conversations with community residents, create a set of principles that can guide how experiential education is done within the Jane Finch community. So initially, this is just to really demonstrate our engagement process. The foundation of all our work, our research, our outreach, really is to ensure that the well-being of the community is at hand. So the community is really, the community anti-oppression, anti-racist is really the framework. It's our priority. And it's how we move in terms of the work that we do. So initially, when we got the grant, what we started doing was outreach. So we started reaching out to community organizations and grassroots groups. It was imperative to reach out to program managers, right? And coordinators that work directly with placement students. What we also quickly learned was that, and that will come up later on, was that different organizations operate differently. So whereas in one organization, there is one person that sort of handles placement or practicum students coming in different organizations, there are different people that do that. So initially, it was important to be able to reach out to as many community residents, leaders, grassroots groups as possible, because our work is based in a community. We're also community residents. A lot of the community leaders we already know, we've already built existing relationships. So on the individual level, myself, Chanelli, and our core team, we live in the community. We've also worked in different capacity in the community. So we already have that previous relationships, but also in terms of the project is collaborative based. There is no report or decisions that are made without a collaborative process. And so previously in putting together the principles for doing research, because a lot of that process went through community consultation, we had also built previous relationships with a lot of community leaders and a lot of community coordinators. So we went back to the same people to reach out to them and to share the grant and the work with them. We also reached out to experiential education coordinators at York University. We thought that it was imperative to also understand what does the experiential education process look like from the university's perspective. And we also quickly learned that different faculties also have their own process to doing experiential education, right? Placements and practicums, that there isn't a one size fits all. A lot of our consultations have really been conversation based. We've developed a set of questions for the community perspective. So from the community perspective in our consultations, our question is really understanding what does the community need when it comes to experiential education. What is the community looking for in terms of the placements and practicum students, internships, volunteers that are coming in from the institutions? What does the community need from the university? And then on the other piece, the experiential education coordinators that we'll be speaking to, a lot of that piece is really understanding how are students prepared, right, to go into the community? And what does that preparation piece also look like? As we've been doing consultations, we're also working to put together a community advisory board. So just to quickly state that this project is still very new. We're literally like 4 or 5 months into the project. So this is really like a report back process for us. Yeah, 5 months into the project. So as we're still doing consultations and collecting data, at the same time, we're summarizing data, we're analyzing the data, but a big piece of that is also a lot of the community managers and coordinators that we've been interviewing, really bringing them together to create a community advisory board so they can inform the principles or the report or the resources that come out of this research. And then from there, it's then writing the principles, but of course, writing the principles in collaboration with the advisory board, review and feedback. So a lot of what we do, once again, as mentioned, is consultation. So taking the research back to the community, like this process, right? 4 months in is bringing this back to the institution. We'll be taking this back to the community and getting feedback about the work, about the process. Collaboration, getting feedback is imperative to how the work is done. And then from there, a community open house to really share the work. And then follow-up will be an outreach to share the principles and how different organizations and community groups can incorporate the principles to support students who are coming into the community to do experiential education.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the community organizations and the grassroots groups that we have connected with. So as Avna mentioned, this is a very new project. It has only been for 5 months or so. So the past few months, I've been working on, or we've all been working on reaching out to community organizations and grassroots group and really making sure that they're a part of this process, and we're hearing their opinions and we're hearing what they have to say and the challenges they've faced, and really getting their input, because again, like, this is meant to be a relationship with the community and the institution. So we've reached out to leaders in the community, grassroots groups, managers, programs coordinators, frontline workers, as many people as we really can to get a good understanding of what it's like to work with placement students, and what impacts do placement students have in the community, and what are the community's needs for experiential education. So it was really important for us to connect directly with them, and because they play a key role in this process, and they play a key role in the training and preparation for students to engage in their experiential education. So throughout the past few months, we've connected with a number of groups and individuals. Most of these meetings have 1 to 2 people, and we're able to have a conversation about their experiences, challenges, and moving forward, what would they like to address. So we've talked to Jane Finch Education, Success Beyond Limits, Jane Finch Economics, BCCHC, which is the Black Creek Community Health Center, Community Engagement Center, Jane Finch Center, and OPIRG. So these are all organizations that we've talked to, and we've gotten their opinions on what really has been their experience. So I'll give some example of the questions we've asked. Let me just go to the next slide. So the community responses. So now that we've kind of done a good amount of consultations with it's still an ongoing process. We're still reaching out to people. We're still having conversations, but we've started to put together the responses and the themes that have come out of these consultations of what are the community's needs, right? So in each of these consultations, there are 13 questions that we ask in each conversations, and they're meant to guide the conversation to help us get a clear understanding on what systems and supports exist within the community, what's working, what's not working, and how to support placement students, right? What training and capacity does the organization or manager have for placement students and to support placement students? Because something that we've been hearing as well is, although some organizations may want to support students more and want to give training and things like this, they don't always have the capacity to do so, right? So in some of the responses, we're learning that most students are coming into community from nursing, social work. Social work's a big one. There's a lot of social work students, education, environmental studies, your social service students. There's students from York University, Seneca, George Brown. From George Brown, there's the mental health program, community services program, and some social work students from Ryerson as well. So it kind of depends. The students come from all over the city. They're coming from everywhere, different institutions. So again, as I mentioned earlier, students are coming in with different backgrounds and knowledges and different lived experience that isn't always fit to work in the Jane Finch community, which is why these trainings are so important. So throughout the past few consultations, we're learning that each organization has their own orientation, and these orientations differ from each organization. So some of them are geared towards their organizational policies and systems, and not necessarily the community, its history, or the socioeconomic conditions of the community, which are all key pieces to know while working in the community and interacting with residents and really being on the front lines. So a lot of organizations don't, as I mentioned, don't have the capacity or financial resources to be able to provide the needed and necessary support that placement students need. So most placement students don't, as of right now or in the past, there are times where placement students don't get that knowledge. There is some trainings that are given before they come into community. However, those trainings done by the CEC and Jane Finch Center, they're meant to be a start. They aren't meant to be the end of the training, right? So it's definitely important that we keep this going. So here on the screen, you can see a few critical themes that are coming out of these, the community's experiences with placement students. So there's trust, accountability, sustainability, community ownership, social justice, and anti-racism. So our question is, what does the community need from the university when it comes to doing experiential education in Jane Finch? So that's like the overarching question. And when it comes to trust, the community wants to be able to build trust with the university. As Abhina mentioned in the beginning, the relationship with the university wasn't always it wasn't always great. There was definitely a lot of harms done to the community, such as the Shoreham Bridge example that Abhina gave in the beginning, that they told students in their orientation and Frosh not to cross the Shoreham Bridge, which directly connects the community. with the institution. So the community wants to be able to build trust with the university, and for the university to see that the community is already a site where knowledge is produced, and for the university to be clear, honest, and consistent about its role and commitment in Jane and Finch. So trust is definitely a big one that has come up. That's why it's at the top of our list. And then we have accountability. The university needs to share its resources with the community. Organizations and community also have a responsibility to support students, especially racialized students and marginalized students that are looking to get experience in the field. Sustainability. So to properly plan placements in the way that students are not constantly coming in and out of the community and leaving work unfinished, and financial sustainability and student community engagement. So definitely something that's sustainable in the long run and a system that works, right? So that is also a big one. Then there's community ownership. So we've learned that the community wants to be recognized for its work and contribution, for its local social movements, for research produced by residents and life experiences, and to incorporate the arts and murals as a way of knowing. And we have social justice and anti-racism. So how can students embody the values of social justice in their everyday work? When they come into a community and they come in and they're working with the community, how can they really embody the community's values? So we are still in this process of learning more. We're in the process of interviewing, summarizing, and analyzing the data that we currently have. And we are sure that this is just a start to the themes. There's definitely going to be more themes that emerge as we continue to summarize and analyze this data. But so far, this is what we've learned.
Thank you, Shanelle. Yes. That was wonderful. And when we also then interviewed EE coordinators at York University. So we reached out to global health, social work, nursing, education, health management, kinesiology. So initially we reached out to ANDA. So ANDA has been a part of the Jane and Finch Community Research Partnership. And so when the research came up, we immediately reached out to her, and then ANDA was able to connect us with other EE coordinators at York. Initially, one of the things that we learned is that every department has their own experiential education process, that the university doesn't have a one size fits all. So nursing has its process, social work has its process, education has its process, and global health also has its process. One thing that we also learned is even how the university defines experiential education. So for community residents coming in, I thought experiential education was just internships and placements and volunteering. But through the consultations, we learned that experiential education could be having a guest speaker, right? In the classroom, that it was hands-on, that the university has an expansive definition when it comes to experiential education. And so that was really interesting to really learn and to really hear from the EE coordinators. Another key piece that we also learned was how different each department operates. So for social work, a lot of the principles around anti-oppression, anti-racism training, gender equity, a lot of these, because it is a helping profession, a lot of these sort of concepts and ideas are already tied into a lot of the courses, right? So for social work students coming into marginalized communities or to racialized communities who may be doing their practicum in housing and so forth, a lot of these concepts are not always challenging. And if they're challenging, then they're usually challenging for students who typically come from a privileged background, right? Or students whose social location doesn't often look like that. It was also interesting to learn that similar to nursing students, once again, nursing is it's a practicum profession. And so in these professions, students are already in the community, right? Anti-oppression. These themes are that embody how a lot of community organizations operate, is already a part of their course deliveries. And what we also learned in other programs such as, health management, kinesiology, or global health, whereas placements look very different, right? So perhaps a social work student may start placements depending on the school in third year, right? They may be doing 40 hours or 30 hours, whereas in other programs, it's not as extensive, right? Students may not be doing the exact same number of hours, only because their work after graduation looks different, right? They may not be working directly in racialized communities. They may not be working in housing. They may not be working in child welfare. So the placement process looks different. The preparation for placement also look different. And also the hours, right, that students are also spending looks different. So students are coming in with like different experiences when it comes to your placements and practicum. Another thing that we also learned from the EE coordinators is that they don't always have a say in terms of where students are placed. It really also depends on the community organizations, right? So they can reach out to a community organization and the organization may not necessarily have capacity, right? Or it also depends on a number of factors that mentioned, right? Availability, place, space, number of students in the program. So for instance, if it's a program with 100 social work students and you have to place all 100 students, then a lot of students won't be able to do their practicum in the community. A lot of students may be doing their practicum an hour or two away. Another thing that also came up is, and it came up on both sides, which I thought was interesting. So on the community consultations, some program coordinators talked about the fact that there should be opportunities for racialized students in the community. So if there's a racialized student who goes to York or whatever institution and they live in the community, they should sort of have a first come, first serve, so that they can be able to get that hands-on experience in their community, right? Because they have that relationship and they have that lived experience. Whereas on the other end, in terms of how the institutions operate, well, depending on the department, that student may not get that option, right? That student may get a placement that is an hour away, 30 minutes away, and whatever the case in the context is, right, to placing students. So it was interesting to be able to see the complexities that operate on both sides, to see, so one piece on the university pieces, what does the student need to be able to fulfill their degree, right? So very real issues that are coming in play. What does the student need? A lot of students may not necessarily be interested in doing a placement or a practicum. They might just want to get their degree and be done with. So that also plays a role in how the students may show up in doing their placements and practicum. Another key piece is also when students are in placements, right? The follow-up and the evaluation process also plays a role. So, and that depends on that student's relationship with the course instructor. So when we started, a lot of, and Farwa, who's also here, led that consultation. A lot of our consultations was with the experiential education coordinators, but we quickly realized, well, they informed us that now we also have to speak to the program coordinator. So it was important to speak to the program coordinator who designs the experiential education, the placements, will be the one to speak with, right? Because if we're hearing from the community perspective that, these are the themes that came up around accountability, sustainability, how then do we communicate this information back to the institution? So the EE coordinators are the ones that are doing sort of the practical logistics pieces of placing students. And then the next step is then to speak to the program directors themselves, the ones that are planning the placements, right? As they have a say in terms of what does evaluation look like. One of the things we also learned is that orientation looks different, right? For every student. So a student in global health who's doing their placement will have a different orientation, right? As per department guidelines, per a student in social work or per student in nursing. And so when you have these students that are meeting in a community organization, you have a student from social work, nursing, global health that are all meeting at a particular community organization, you're coming with a set of different skills, right? So the community is wondering, how come all these students don't have this preparation from York University to coming to do this training? But on the program level, the preparation all looks very, 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 very different. So it's really interesting, I think, to learn the piece in how the university defines experiential education, because I think that's a conversation that needs to happen with community organizations, right? so that community organizing around expectations, right? What are the expectations? Because the university has its sets of expectations for the student. The students have their own expectation for themselves in terms of what they want to learn. And then the university also have their set of expectations, right? And one of the things that we learned on the community side while doing the consultations is that for the community, at the end of the day, what matters at the heart is the well-being, right? The community will always be a priority. So what does that look like for the academy that is now shifting to making sure that students are getting this core life learning, real life learning as part of their process? So these were interesting things that came up. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I can go on here, yeah. So a few things, sorry, can you go back one sec? I think I missed that. Did I go through that? Yeah, university, yes. Students, yeah, the student skills and program. Okay, great, sorry, I thought I missed something. We could go next. All right, so a few things that also came up. So then the question was, what then, right? What are the next steps? And what does that look like? So you have different community organizations that all have their own training, right, in terms of orientation. So if I'm mapping out from the community side, right, as a student comes, they are prepared for placement. Most of the time, they do their placements in the 4th year. They're doing it for a set number of hours. The orientation the student gets on the university side is really around it's not in terms of the community orientation, it's more so an orientation based on that course, that class, right? What are your placement goals? What are they hoping to get out of your placement? And evaluation processes. When the student is now placed into the community, depending on the community organization, every organization has their own placements, their own orientation. Very often, the orientation that the community organization have is not the same across border, right? So Black Creek Community Health Center does not have the same orientation as Jane Finch Center. And it makes sense because a health center is based on health and well-being, etc. So a lot of their orientation is around the social determinants of health, right? And a lot of the other orientations are really around organizational policies, right? To be able to prepare the student to work in a manner that is respectful to the organization and recipients. When it comes to Jane Finch Center, same thing, right? They have their own policies. And so it's imperative to train the students. Orientation really evolves around organizational policies, right? Around violence, gender equity, disability, like all these other pieces that are crucial to the organizational policies and structure. So there isn't really a space that or a general orientation that really prepares the student to have the community knowledge in order to do their placements, right? In a way that is useful to the community, but also in a way that is useful for the students' learning and education. So some of the things that came up in terms of how students can be prepared to do experiential education with the Jane and Finch community. One, that it was important for students to have history and background of the Jane and Finch community, right? The community is very diverse, it's dynamic, and it has a history of activism, a history of resistance. And so it's important for students to be able to know what the history and background is, so that you're not coming with your own perception of what they think the community is and who they think lives in the community. Another key piece is also that it's important for students to have a workshop or be trained in talking about identity and social location, right? So for instance, in one of the orientation that we had, one of the program coordinators was giving us an example, even with the snowstorm that happened, right? The challenges around navigating the bus, right? Even if you were trying to take the bus to York, standing at the Jane and Finch intersection, waiting to get a bus, you get here walking, just all that complexities. For a student that is coming, and that complexity is about access, right? But for someone else who's coming from a privileged community, that may not be something they're thinking about. That's not something that's in their worldview. So it's important to have the conversation on identity, social location, and privilege. So students who are coming into the community don't necessarily think they're coming to save the community, right? Another key piece was decolonizing stigma and stereotypes, right? And it goes back to the example that we gave, right, around the orientation piece, where students are told not to cross the Shoreham Bridge. We've had many examples that have been given. Another example was a few years ago when there was a series of sexual assault cases happening at York. There was an article that was written in the Excalibur stating that, you know, these things were happening because the university was in the community, and JFAB really responded, came to the community, came to the campus and responded to that. And so these are the perceptions, right, that really create a certain kind of stereotype or stigma about who the community is and how the community operates. Another key piece is cultural knowledge and cultural competency, right? It's also an important training to have, and also community capacity and priorities. And I think that ties to the accountability piece, and it also ties to the sustainability piece. Community organizations just don't always have the capacity. You have, for instance, you may have a program coordinator who is working with the community, working with residents, they're working on a tight budget, and now there's a student now who's doing your placement that they have to oversee, right? The student has a set of goals, they have to be evaluated. So that's extra work on a program coordinator who may not necessarily have the capacity or be well-resourced, but also also, yeah, just doesn't have the capacity very often to be able to provide that. So some of the things that came up was really for the university to also have their priorities, right? Or for the department to also have their priorities, or to really understand what the priorities of the community is and how the community can also support the students within their resources, that they have. And I think this piece ties into the resource sharing between the academy and the community. And there's also community mapping, right? Community mapping is really just walking with students through the community to really understand and see, when we talk about access, what does that look like in the community? When we talk about, you know, accessing healthcare, accessing groceries, going to the library, right? Really, and it ties back to the identity and social location, and really allowing students to understand the socioeconomic conditions of the community. Another key piece was really language and awareness. And then critical thought and reflection, right, should also be a key part of the process. In one of the consultations that we had, and it was a great one, they mentioned that when a lot of students come in, they're really afraid to voice out their perspective or their perceptions. They don't want to seem discriminatory. They don't want to seem racist or sexist. So very often they have very real questions because it's not their worldview, right? It's not their worldview. It's not how they see the world. With as much training as possible, students are still coming with their own perception of the world. And so there needs to be a space where students can honestly ask questions that can shape how they engage with your placements and how they do your placements as well. So that critical thought and reflection moves beyond the evaluation pieces of your placement, but it's really weaved into the placement from beginning to end, right? So even an example of this could be that when students are done with your placement, that's it, right? Community organizations don't see them again, and rightly so, because they've moved on with your life. But it would be great for the students to come back and do a report back, perhaps, right? 6 months after, 1 year after, what have you learned, right? How useful was this placement? You know, did they feel better prepared to get into the working world? So critical thought and reflection, really moving past evaluation to really challenging the student's worldview. And then that really ties into the evaluation pieces. Another piece that I want to add, and I think it falls under the cultural knowledge piece, is also that community wants the institution, not wants the institution to know per se, but that a community is a site of knowledge, right? Knowledge is constantly happening. We're constantly theorizing. Right? These are things that are constantly operating, and we're doing this in many ways. So even in murals, there's a lot of murals in the community, on walls, at the farm, in different places. That's knowledge, right? It may not be the ways in which the academy values knowledge, but that's knowledge, right? Poetry, spoken word, a lot of the activism that's happened, and the community has extensive activists and activism that happens. A lot of this is part of cultural knowledge. So these are pieces that came up. Other comments that came up as well was really prioritizing Black, Indigenous, and students of color. Also, when it comes to placements and practicums, also prioritizing students that live in the community and being able to create pathways, right? Being able to create pathways for racialized students who can not only gain the experience within their own community, but also to be able to give them that leverage in terms of gaining the experience, the capacity to be able to get the experience they need, whether it's for graduation or to add into their placement experience. So there's a lot of information, a lot of data I'm like rushing through that came up, but these are the ones that we pulled together to be able to share for this presentation. Next slide, Shanelli. And so in terms of next steps, one of the things that have come up, and it was already in the grant and in our work plan, is to create a community advisory board to review the process. So within the structure of the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership, we already have a core group, which is made up of community residents, organization, York University researchers that we meet monthly and review the work of the project at large, but to also create an advisory group. So a lot of the coordinators that we are meeting with and community leaders, we will be creating an advisory board with them, since we've already spoken with them, build a relationship and interview them. And they will be part of the advisory board to review the findings, the data, the report, and the principles that are coming in. Report back to the York EE coordinators. So last year, we were also invited to speak to the Experiential Education coordinators meeting to inform them about our work. So a follow-up back to that meeting to also report the work, the findings. And next piece is also to connect with department chairs as well. To a bigger part is also rethinking community university partnership and relationship. And it really ties into the so what, right? So what, and what are the next steps after this? How does the academy incorporate this? How does the community incorporate this? How does this become a living document, right? That really informs how placements are structured, or how experiential education is done, but specifically placements, practicum, internships, etc. And then the next piece is also then taking this data and developing principles, right, that guide how we do experiential education. And the principles will tie back to the theme, right, of trust, accountability, sustainability, and so forth. And then hoping that next year, with the advisory group and with the exact same community leaders, we will be looking at how then can we create a modules, right? So with this data that we've collected, one of the things that we keep hearing is that community organizations honestly just don't have the capacity to be able to provide all these trainings that we've talked about. They just don't have the capacity, the resources, and the budget. So perhaps looking at being a space with the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership can then take this on to be able to provide this workshop. So when students are coming in, they do this workshop training through us before starting with community organizations. This might not be the process, it's just a part of the conversation. It will look different depending on what the rest of the findings are. It will look different once the principles have come out, and will also look different depending on what the advisory group think will work best for the community. Next slide. Yes, and I think that's pretty much it. Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. Sorry for speeding through. If you have any questions, comments, you can ask us. It's still a fairly new project, as we said before. So Shanelli and I literally just started analyzing and pulling this together. So yeah, this is our first time presenting it. We thought we'd just be vulnerable and start sharing the information and feedback. So thank you, folks.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Thank you. There were so many things that you brought up that were intriguing. So many things that you brought up that made me want to jump into the conversation right away to ask you for more things. And of course, we always have to wait till you hear everything. So, and I really like the way you've outlined all of these things. And you talk about being vulnerable. But I like that you're sharing work as it goes on. But then, of course, and outlining some of the things that community members are bringing up. Issues of trust, accountability are really high, I think, for anyone that does any or wants to do any kind of meaningful work in any community anywhere in the world. So thank you for sharing those things with us in this presentation. So I'll open the floor now to people who have questions. And maybe Shinali, if you can stop sharing the screen, that way we can see everybody in the room. That way I can also see people who are putting up their hands. So if you have any questions and you want to raise your hand, I'll just call on you and unmute and ask, or you can ask your questions in the chat box as well. There's some really great comments, of course, in the chat, as we can see. And I mean, I think they echo what I've just said. Just as we're waiting for questions, I'll start. Okay, there's a hand. Yvonne.
Good morning again, Professor Bao and members presenting on this phenomenal work pertaining to Jane Finch community. I just think it's amazing the amount of work that you've done in such a short space of time, and recognizing how much energy and effort it takes to do just that. As you were speaking, I took a quick look at the document you produced that cataloged your work and its intentions. That's phenomenal. And I applaud you loudly, because that work is so necessary. And I also have a deep appreciation for how much effort it takes to do just that. So my hat's off to you in so many ways. I was really interested in the areas having to do with practicums, because I teach and work and in the disabilities area. And I think it's one of the areas that is really challenging for communities, especially communities of racialized communities, because there's such a diversity to begin with, but then there's such a diversity as well when it comes to disability support services and practicums. So in my program in which I teach, students are, as you've just articulated so accurately, opportunities for placements are really important. But there's really a lack of orientation to getting an inroad into effective placements and to get the supports, because students are graduating to be experts in disability support services. Those interactions have to be so well mentored, and there's a lack of entree into appropriate mentorships, especially when students are themselves racialized, wanting to work within their community, and they don't have those opportunities. My big question after that long-winded explanation is to say, do you foresee potential opportunities where you could foster that connection to community agencies working with persons with disabilities, and how potentially could you foresee developing something to provide that orientation, or that orientation, as you mentioned, or that mentorship, so that students can enter into those areas with greater ease, and the individual needs of persons with disabilities can be responded to in an effective way when it comes to practicums in the Jane Finch area?
Thanks, Yvonne. That's a very heavy question and very important. The first thing that came to mind was the priorities of the community is not of the university, right? That's the challenge. And the priority of the community is already at capacity. And I think that in order to be able to build that, like to prepare the community or the organization so that the students that are coming from disability status or students with disabilities can get meaningful mentorship and meaningful practicum, I think that first there has to be a space where this communication is happening, right? There has to be a space of conversation. I don't think this conversation is happening between university and the community, particularly the people that are at the forefront of this, right? So I don't think the program coordinators, the experiential education workers, maybe the chairs, the chair of the different faculty. I think that conversation first needs to happen with executive directors, frontline workers, and program coordinators, right? So I think first the conversation needs to happen so that it is clear what the expectation is, but also it's clear what the capacity is. Because a lot of organizations are not, they're already under-resourced, right? Organizations are already under-resourced. A lot of organizations are hiring program coordinators or managers on short grants. So 1-year grant, 2-year grants. There isn't that sort of long-term hiring sustainability. They're also hiring program managers and frontline workers based on, other programs, right? So maybe some other youth fund. So already there is employment sort of precariousness that's already happened within the organization. And there isn't a lot of resources already going around. So usually, and then coupled with the fact that then that program coordinator has to do their daily activities and now attend to at least 2 or 3 right? Placement students that are coming in. So I think the conversation has to happen across the institution and then the community. And I think figure out then what does that capacity looks like, because if the institution wants the community to be able to provide that kind of mentorship, then there needs to be resource sharing, right? The university has to start saying, well, now we have to start putting some dollars into some community organizations, because these community organizations are mentoring, this many social work students, or are mentoring this many students coming in from disability status, right? Or this many students that are coming in with disabilities. So I think the conversation needs to be had. And I think it goes back to a lot of the themes that came back around trust. Trust is already broken. So what does it look like for the community to take this responsibility on? Right? And I think then there are issues of liability and then the sustainability pieces. But I think there needs to be a clear conversation around what the community needs. And if the university wants the community to support its students, then they need to invest. They need to invest in terms of resources. They need to shift how you're having the conversation with the community so that they can build the trust. So that so the community knows that when they invest in the student, that they're investing in themselves, right? They're investing in the community, because very often the community invests in the students and just don't see a return, right? Coming back in any shape or form, especially if the placement is 1 month or 2 months or 3 months and the student is gone, or 3 hours a week, right? Where relationships are built and then they're gone, right? So I think and it goes back to that relationship building piece, right? I think the university and the community the university needs to have this conversation, but there needs to be resource sharing. Yeah, that happens. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yvonne, for that question. I thank you for that question. And also thank you very much, Abina, for that. I completely agree in terms of, and I think you mentioned it when you talked about sustainability, because that was also going to be my question. What happens if, a community organization becomes, as a result of temporary capacity from a placement student, they take on something and all of a sudden the student leaves? Do you know usually how they rally around? What can you talk a little bit more about that if people have discussed some of those things?
Chanel, should I take? You can, yeah, it's come up in some of the conversations, so you can join it after, or you can start. But we've had these kinds of conversations where, program coordinators have told us that students will come in, they'll be very excited, they will start a project, And then when the placement is done, they leave, right? And then the project is hanging, you know, all the start, and they would join existing strong community tables. You know, they're contributing, they're doing research projects, they're taking notes, and then they leave. And very often this really, it severs the relationship between the university and the community, because the community is not looking at that student as the student. They're looking at that student as York, right? It's not that this particular student came and left. It's York has brought another student and hasn't really considered the community priority, the community needs. And now the students is here, you know, we're giving our time, our resources, our energy, you know, to supporting them, whether it's placement trainings, whether it's engagement, etc. And then the student leaves, right? And then another person comes, and then you have to train them all over again. So it exerts a lot of energy to have to do that over and over again. And that piece, maybe a bit of that response is perhaps the university rethinking how it does practicum and placements, and what does that look like? And that perhaps maybe the 40 hours is not enough. Maybe just doing it fourth year long is not enough. Maybe it could be third year and fourth year. I'm obviously not sure about those pieces. That's for the university to figure out, but there are implications, right? And the implications for the communities that there's a lot of unfinished projects and unfinished work. And so, and then to build a relationship with like residents, and then students leave, and then residents are like, what happened to that student, right? So, or you come to another new meeting, and then they have to do a new orientation and reintroduction and another history. So it exerts a lot of time and a lot of energy.
Yeah, just to add on to that as well, I think it's important to note, like, it's already so difficult with the little amount of time for a meaningful relationship to be built, right? So like maybe that 40 hours, like sometimes like students come in like once a week for a few hours, and then they spend their hours, you know, doing the training and whatever, and then they leave, right? So kind of just reiterating what Abna said, but yeah, it's already so difficult to have that relationship. So to keep that going is definitely difficult, and it's using a lot of community capacity and resources just to be offering this training, right? And to be offering meaningful lesson. And every organization also has their own goals of what they want the students to learn as well. So it's definitely like difficult to keep that going when it's just students come in and then they're gone, right? And it's like and it's just a cycle, right? So it definitely is a big challenge for community.
Are there people who have other questions? Yes, Mark.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for this really interesting presentation. And I'm sorry, and also thanks to RCPS for organizing this event. And I'm a department chair in sociology. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions just from my perspective as chair of a program that doesn't have experiential education built into it in a very structured way yet, but we've certainly had conversations about it. And also there's, some individual instructors have been exploring different ways of developing experiential education initiatives. So, and I know we'll probably have further conversations and figure out ways to move forward. I guess a couple of things I was wondering if you could talk a little more about. You'd mentioned there's different ways of understanding what experiential education is and what it involves, and particularly from there may be ways that the university or the institution sees it as compared to differences within the community, and maybe differences in terms of how you've taken it up as well. So I was wondering if you could talk about especially some of the different ways that that the university might be approaching this as compared to what you're seeing through your work and within the community, like what experiential education involves in terms of expectations and that kind of thing. And then the other question I wanted to bring up, just again, perspective of a department chair that's really interested in this. Do you have any advice for academic departments that might be starting to take up these conversations, and what might be some important things that we should consider as we start to work on maybe developing some experiential education programs?
Abna, maybe you can speak a little bit about the university perspective, and I can talk a little bit about the communities.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. From the consultations that we had, it seems from the EE coordinators that the university perspective is really around the students fulfilling their degree, right? So doing the necessary work the student needs to do to fulfill their degree. Whereas from the community, and then experiential education could look different, right? So it's having a guest speaker in its experiential education, having a lab, whatever all those other pieces are, right? So experiential education is just not placements and practicum. Whereas from the community's perspective, experiential education should be aligned with the priorities of the community, right? So it's looking at what are the needs of the Jane and Finch community, what are the needs as per the organization, as per residents, and then aligning a student's learning, whether so if a social work student is coming and you're looking at doing something in housing, then it's aligning that student's work with the priorities of the community. So I think in one piece, it's looking at what are the priorities of the community, what capacity does the community have in order to support students coming in, and also how is this conversation happening, right? Because how the university sees experiential education is different from how the community sees it, but the conversation are not happening in the same rooms. And if the community is saying it, then the university is probably not listening, right? Which I'm not throwing the university under the bus, has been the experience, right? Because the community may not necessarily be saying it in the language or in the way that the university is used to hearing things. So the community can say, we don't have capacity, it doesn't work, we can't take any more students. And the university can say, we try to send students in that community, but they're not taking them, right? And so we just can't do it anymore. Meanwhile, it's a conversation around resources, expectation, and priority. So I think first, there needs to be a conversation, right, between the two, in terms of what does it mean. And I think the challenge is that there is the university's expectation, there is the students' learning, and there's the community priority. And how do you bring these three? Like, what are the negotiations between a student's learning and capacity? And, some students are doing 2-3 jobs. Some students are, working part-time, and the placement, they just want to finish their degree, right? So how do you negotiate that with priorities and universities also, I guess, expectation for the students? So these conversations are not being had in the same spaces. And if they are happening, then I'm not sure if the university is really hearing the community. So I think what needs to happen is that these conversations needs to be had, and it goes back to community relationship partnership, right? I think it goes back to, if the university is looking at steering towards experiential education, what does that look like for the communities they're taking students in, as opposed to assuming that the communities have the capacity? What does it look like, right? What does it look like from the theorizing perspective to the everyday practical, perspective? Because the people that students are engaging with, it's not another course material, right? These are people's real lives, right? Someone is coming to a health center, sharing their life. These are people's real lives. So however students engage with residents or in the communities that you're engaging with people's lives, everyday lives. So I think like there needs to be that not emerge, but that conversation needs to happen. And I would say to your second question is, conversations. Like, if a department or faculty is looking at, starting this, what does that look like? I think it's reaching out to the community, right? Having conversations with key community leaders, having conversations with key community organizations. But at the same time, I do want to say that the community is also at capacity. So it's also a challenge. They're also at capacity. They're also tired of saying the same things over and over again. So it's really figuring out strategic ways and bringing money and resources to having these conversations with people who feel like they've done this so many times and they haven't been heard. So, yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for your question. Thank you. Yes, Shanelli?
Yeah, I was just gonna echo what was said in the chat as well. It is a very complex issue, and I think at the end of the day, what was said was there needs to be further communication, collaboration, and creating partnerships, right? Like creating partnerships, meaningful partnerships with the community, right? Like that's definitely different as well. Because how many times, like, you know, the community has, as Afna mentioned, like the community is tired, right? Like there's been so many times that Yorkers just come in and like listen, but not really listen, and then left, right? So it's important that, you know, the institutions are really listening to what the community has to say and really listening to, you know, the problems that they're facing, right? And the complex issues, and really learning from that and making sure there's ways to support the community throughout this process, right? So definitely just emphasizing on the conversations, the collaborations, the communications, and all the themes that we've outlined so far.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, also for that question. And thank you, Abinay and Co, for emphasizing again the importance of keeping these lines of communication open. But I'm also glad that you obviously, I mean, you've mentioned this a lot, you know, in terms of resources, and, you know, sometimes we also shy away from what resources are, but money is a big one, you know, because again, we are asking people to do work over and over again. People take time out, community organizations that are largely under-resourced. So, you know, and money is not the only the only thing, but I mean, I think those keeping those communication channels open and ensuring that the communities get something back is what I'm hearing a lot from these conversations. Are there other questions? Are there other questions? And I'm seeing also in the chat that, you know, many people are also very appreciative of all the work that you are doing. I did have another question, which is around, it kind of builds off on your discussion around sustainability, but also moves a little bit. And you, when you mentioned that, you know, when a student is placed in the community organization or with a community organization, that York probably needs to start being more careful, because that makes complete sense. It's obvious, but up until now, that hadn't also really hit me as much as other people, that people are not seeing that student as the individual, you know, but as the York University representative or ambassador, in other words, right? Because then people are not dealing with that person as an individual, but dealing with that person because a department from York University placed them there. You know, so that going back to that issue of trust is very important. The one thing that I wanted to ask, and probably it's a bit of a thorny issue, is around this area of knowledge competency or cultural competency. And, you know, people encountering students who may have questions that they are afraid to ask, you know, because of all of these things, especially stereotypes. But I'm also curious now about how, you know, on the individual level or the small scale level, what you think is the way forward in terms of, you know, why are they afraid to ask some of those questions? Is it because they would immediately be tagged as ignorant, not being prepared, even though in many cases, you know, and again, it's a very thorny issue, because when people say, why are you asking me these questions? That information is out there, but we know that there's tons of information out there. So, you know, what is the fear? What do you find that there's a bit of a barrier in engaging in those real conversations that we accuse Canadians of never having, right? You know, especially when it comes to having conversations, interracial conversations, people just have a certain, you know, there's something there, you know, people are afraid to ask certain questions. Is there, can you elaborate just a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's complex. I think we need to create learning spaces, right? And it's figuring out what those learning spaces are. So you have students who are coming in, and York University students coming in are diverse, right? There are students coming in from working class, but there are also students coming in from very privileged background who may, in taking certain programs and courses, certain terminologies such as anti-racist, anti-oppression, these are very new, right? For students to be able to digest and then to then make sense of how then does this apply to them in the real world. So that's one working piece, right? and then you're doing this placement where for some of them, it's a joy if it matches up with their worldview and careers, etc. And for other students, it's just, I need to finish my degree and move on with life. I think it's about creating spaces of learning. I'm not sure what that can look like, but this terminology has been overused, safe spaces for learning. So I don't want to say safe spaces, because it's also exhausting for community members to say, so for instance, student coming in, like we've heard all kinds of things, to say, well, no, I don't hear gunshots, right? It's exhausting, it's violence when a community resident has to say that to different people, right? Over the course of 10 years. It's like, no, that's not my reality in this place. So it's always, how can you create that space where students can ask honest questions that could definitely shape their worldview, but at the same time with community residents that are just at capacity, right? Like, where does that balance happen? I don't know yet, but I think it's creating spaces of learning. And I don't know what that could look like. I think these are spaces that could be incorporated in the critical thought and reflection workshop. So we know that within the year that you were taking the critical thought and reflection, that you can ask these things, right? And your instructor or these set of community folks can support you to be able to unpack this. So yeah, one piece is also because Canadians don't want to be labeled as racist or as anything. So we avoid having the difficult conversations because we just don't want to go there at all. So that can also play a huge role.
Any other questions, final thoughts before we close things? Well, I'd like to, on behalf of the Resource Center for Public Sociology, thank you so very much, Abina and Shinali, for sharing with us again. And I'm sure, again, as you've said, you've shared so much of your work with so many people, but taking that time and the care to share with us your work, as you can see from the charts, and everybody's been appreciative of helping us to think about these things a little bit more. So thank you so much. And I'm also grateful that you've allowed us to record this and post it on our website, as well as share this with the attendants of the workshop, some of whom are also going to further share the information. So hopefully we are getting out the message that we need to continue these conversations, and that accountability, trust, sustainability are really important when we think about, about these kinds of conversations. And I would also like to do a plug-in for one of our programs, events that is coming up next week, Friday. We are going to have another conversation, not like this. This is a global conversation as well, similar to this because it is an engagement with our community, but our global community in this particular case, where we have people who are going to be discussing this issue of COVID-19 and vaccine equity as we are seeing in the world, or the vaccine apartheid issue that we are seeing in the world. I've just dropped the link to that for those of you who've not seen it and have not registered. It will be Friday next week, the 28th of January, from 1 to 2:30 p.m. And we'll be hosting it here again. So I also promised to share with you the website, Abina's website, when I was doing the introduction, and I read about the work that she does on her website, and I almost forgot that, but I will fulfill that promise before we leave today. So here it is. So again, I just wanted to say thank you. Those of you who are still on, if you can unmute and clap loudly, not just with your cartoon.
Thank you.
Say something, as if say, make some noise as we say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
for having us. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
And bye, everyone. And for those of you who are also unmuting from your camera, it helps. I just find that Zoom conversations can be so alienating, right? And so a little bit of something that makes us not feel too far away from each other is a bit helpful. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.